Pay attention to the latest update from Mateo Moreto, because he has just revealed information that could completely change the future of Julián Álvarez and also FC Barcelona's plans for this summer. Because according to the Italian journalist, one of the most reliable sources in the European transfer market, Julián Álvarez has already informed Atlético de Madrid of his true intentions. And pay attention, because what he has communicated internally is not going to please many Atlético fans at all. According to this information, Julián has made it clear to Atlético de Madrid that he would like to go somewhere else. And most importantly, his wish is still to join FC Barcelona. Yes, FC Barcelona. We're not talking about just any rumor, nor are we talking about just another transfer speculation. We're talking about information that once again puts Barça at the center of a deal that many considered practically impossible. But wait, because this isn't even the most shocking part. The most shocking part comes when Mateo Moreto once again reaffirms something he has been insisting on for weeks. And he did it publicly, without qualification, without backing down, and without changing a single word. I still stand by my information. Mateo Moreto has been this firm, and when he insists on something, it's because he is absolutely convinced. Because he has sources, because he knows exactly what he's doing. And according to those sources, the relationship between Julián Álvarez and Diego Pablo Simeone is not as good as many people have tried to make it seem over the past few months. In fact, he explained something very specific. He said that the relationship is very normal, just normal, just normal. Not excellent, nor extraordinary, nor especially close, no, normal. And this changes a lot of things. Because when a player is fully happy within a project, this kind of information usually doesn't come up. Normally, there isn't constant talk about possible departures. Normally, doubts don't arise every few weeks, but with Julián, exactly the opposite is happening, and that's what starts to draw attention. Now then, there's a question we need to ask ourselves. If Julián is really so comfortable at Atlético de Madrid, why does Barça keep coming up? Why does it continue to be the only club that keeps getting linked with him? Because there's something here that hasn't changed since the very first day. And that's because Barça has never stopped dreaming about Julián Álvarez. In fact, he's always been their priority. Since Hansi Flick's arrival, there's been a very strong conviction within the club that Julián is the perfect striker to lead the new project. Because of his age, quality, character, mobility, and goal-scoring ability. And because he fits perfectly into the style of football that Hansi Flick wants to build. In fact, people at Barça are convinced that Julián would be one of the most important signings of the entire post-Leo Messi era. It's that clear. That's why Laporta is still paying attention. That's why Deco is still keeping an eye on things. And that's why every piece of information related to the Argentine is followed extremely closely at the club. Because they know that an opportunity like this doesn't come around every year. But wait. Because here comes a detail that could be absolutely key. Mateo Moreto hasn't only talked about his relationship with Simeone. He has also sent a very striking message. He said that Julián Álvarez should come out publicly and explain what he really wants to do. And I totally agree. And this sentence makes a lot of sense and has more meaning than it seems. Because if everything were so clear, there would be no need for explanations or clarifications or even for the player to speak. However, Mateo Moreto insisted. He insists. He insists because he believes there is a gap between what is said publicly and what is really happening in private. And that precisely is what fuels all the speculation. Because when such a well-connected journalist sends that message, it's because he understands that there's still a part of the story left to tell. Now let's imagine for a moment that all this information ends up being confirmed. Let's imagine that Julián is really considering a move and that Barça is still his priority. Let's also imagine that the relationship with Simeone is not exactly at its best right now. Then the question changes completely. Because it would no longer be, does Barça want to sign Julián? We already know that. The answer is yes. The real question would be, can Barça take advantage of this situation? And that's where the real battle begins. Because Atlético de Madrid has no intention of losing one of its biggest stars. We're talking about one of the most important players in their project, one of the footballers expected to lead the club's future. And losing him, especially to Barcelona, would be a huge blow. That's why any negotiation promises to be a real war. But there's something that works in Barca's favor. And that's because in modern football, there's a factor that often ends up being decisive: the player's desire. Because when a footballer knows exactly what he wants, everything changes. Even the negotiations, the pressure, even the timing. And the clubs end up listening. Of course, not always, but it happens much more often than it seems. And this is where Moreto's words become even more valuable. Because if Julián is really conveying his wishes through an intermediary, then the situation is very different from what it seemed just a few weeks ago. Because the door would no longer be closed. And that's exactly what Barça needed to hear. And there's another detail that I think is fundamental. The timing. Because all this information comes out precisely when the clubs are making decisions, when the sporting directors are speeding things up, operations, and when the agents are moving pieces. Also, obviously, when the big summer signings start to be finalized. And right at that moment, doubts about Julián Álvarez come back. Barça is back, Mateo Moreto is back. And the debate around Cholo Simeone is back. Too many coincidences, I would say, right? Too many. Because when so many pieces start to fit together at the same time, it's usually because something is happening behind the scenes. Even if we can't see it yet. And that's why I think the most important news today is not an offer. Not the meeting, not the figure being discussed, not the negotiation. The most important news is something else. And that's that there are reasons to believe again. Because let's be honest, just a few days ago, the feeling was really different. Expectations had dropped. Real Madrid's offer. Probably more than at any other time since this story began, things weren't looking good. Many Barça fans had even started to accept that the deal was impossible, that Atleti was never going to negotiate, that the price was out of reach, that Julián's dream was fading. But friends, Mateo Moreto appears again, and he insists again on something very important, that the relationship with Simeone is not as perfect as they say, and that there are many doubts. That Julián should come out and speak, and that Barça is still very present in this story. But wait, because there's one last detail we can't ignore. And maybe it's the most important of all. Because in recent weeks we've learned that even Real Madrid has entered the scene. A Real Madrid willing to put a truly outrageous amount of money on the table. A deal that would be around 150 million euros, an enormous figure, an amount that would have changed any player's life. However, the answer was no, not from Atlético de Madrid. Pay attention to this. According to the information that has come out about the deal, Julián Álvarez also said no. Because if there's one thing the Argentine striker seems sure about, it's this. If he ever leaves Atlético de Madrid, his priority still has one clear name: FC Barcelona. And that, my friends, changes everything. Because now we're not just talking about money. We're not just talking about the market. We're talking about the player's desire. We're talking about a personal decision. We're talking about a player who, despite the difficulties, still has his sights set on Camp Nou. That's why expectations have dropped. Yes, but hope is growing again. And maybe that's the big headline today. After some very complicated weeks for Barcelona fans, the feeling is no longer that the deal is dead. The feeling is that the story isn't over yet. And as long as Julián Álvarez remains clear about what his favorite destination is, as long as he keeps rejecting other options, and as long as Barça keeps waiting for its opportunity, absolutely anything can happen. And that, my friends, is exactly what excites Barcelona fans again today.